The cold came in off the river that night, like it had something to prove. It pressed through the chain-link fence that lined the back of the parking structure on 5th Street, pushed under the loading dock overhang, where the man slept, and settled into everything it could reach. Sergeant First Class Daniel Mercer noticed none of it. He had trained himself years ago to log temperature as information rather than discomfort, and so the cold was simply a fact of the November night, same as the amber glow of the distant highway. Same as the way the sleeping man under the overhang had tucked his left boot against a support post, almost like someone who expected the ground to shift while he slept. Ranger sat low at Daniel's side, the big shepherd's ears angled forward. Body still, breath steady. The dog had been watching the man for 40 seconds without a single tension signal. No stiffening, no low exhale, just quiet attention. That told Daniel more than he could have learned in an hour of his own observation. He had first seen the man 6 nights ago. Daniel had been cutting through this block on his way back from the late shift at the Veterans Support Office, where he volunteered 3 nights. Weak, and the man had been there under the overhang, talking to no one, sitting completely upright against the wall, with a regulation bearing that stopped Daniel in his tracks. The posture was not the loose, resigned sprawl of someone who had surrendered to the street. It was deliberate, contained. The kind of stillness you trained into yourself over years of being told that how you sat said everything about who you were. Daniel had stood at the edge of the parking structure for a long minute, watching before he turned and walked home. But he had come back the next night, and the night after that. If this story stays with you, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Tonight was night 7, and Daniel Mercer was beginning to understand that whatever had brought this man to the street, it was not weakness. He pulled the collar of his field jacket up and settled onto the concrete retaining wall 30 feet away, setting a paper bag from the diner on Marsh Street beside him. Ranger lowered himself to the ground with that particular economy of motion that meant he was prepared to wait as long as necessary. Daniel was 39 years old, 6'1", with the lean, functional build of a man who had never stopped moving since he turned 18. His hair was dark, cut close, beginning to show a narrow streak of silver above his left ear. His jaw carried 3 days of stubble that would not grow much longer before he trimmed it. He had a scar along the left side of his chin from a vehicle rollover in Kandahar. A faint second one above his right eyebrow that he never explained, and hands that had been broken twice and healed slightly wrong, so the knuckles lay at a fractional angle that most people never noticed. His eyes were a pale, steady gray, the eyes of someone who never truly stopped, scanning rooms, roads, exits, or people. He had served 21 years as an Army infantryman, done 5 combat deployments, and spent the last 4 months living in this mid-sized river city in central Virginia that he had picked partly for its veteran support infrastructure, and partly because it was the sort of city that moved at a pace he could still tolerate. He had not stayed anywhere longer than 18 months since he mustered out. Staying required a level of belief in permanence that he had not yet managed to locate inside himself. The sleeping man stirred. He pushed himself more upright against the post, rolled his neck once, and opened his eyes. Even from 30 feet in the amber shadow, half-light, Daniel could see that the man came awake, the same way he himself always did. All the way immediately, with the eyes already scanning, before the body had finished deciding to move. That was not something you taught yourself later in life. That was something the service put into you until it replaced your original wiring. The man was older, perhaps 68 or 70, though the street had a way of adding years to a face that made it hard to be certain. He was tall, even sitting down, with shoulders that had once been very broad and were now worn slightly inward, as if they had been carrying something invisible for a long time. His hair was fully white, cut close to the skull, in the same regulation style Daniel kept his own hair, though clearly without a barber's help for some weeks. He had a strong jaw, deep-set eyes, and a quality of stillness about the lower half of his face that spoke of a man who had learned very long ago not to let what he felt reach the surface. His coat was a civilian wool blend, dark green, worn through at both elbows. His boots were military surplus, old but cared for, the leather clean despite everything. The man looked across the parking structure at Daniel. He did not flinch. He did not speak. He looked at Daniel the way another soldier looks at someone he does not yet know. Assessment, not hostility. Daniel picked up the paper bag and walked toward him. Ranger walked beside him at perfect heel, not because Daniel had given a command, but because Ranger understood the situation required it. "Brought extra," Daniel said, and set the bag down where the man could reach it without having to stand. The man looked at the bag, then at Ranger, then at Daniel. Ranger had sat down beside Daniel and was looking at the man with a calm, focused attention he reserved for people he had decided were not a problem. "Dog yours?" the man said. His voice was low and unhurried, with a roughness at the bottom of it that might have been the cold or might have been years. "Yes," Daniel said. "What kind?" "German Shepherd, K9 working line." The man nodded once, slowly, as if that confirmed something. He reached into the bag and found the sandwich without which wicked looking, the way a man finds things in the dark by habit. "You've been sitting over on that wall," he said. It was not a question. "6 nights," Daniel said. 7 now. "I know." The man unwrapped the sandwich with careful movements. "What are you after?" Daniel thought about the honest answer. He had been asking himself the same question all week. "I don't know yet," he said. "You've got a bearing that doesn't belong on this block." The man was quiet for a moment. "You served," he said. "Army. Retired 4 years ago. Infantry?" "Yes." The man nodded again and took his first bite, slowly, chewing with the careful attention of someone for whom food had not always been reliable. Ranger watched him eat for a moment, then settled his chin onto his front paws. The man noticed. "Dog trusts easy," he said. "He doesn't, actually," Daniel said quietly. "That's why I came over." Something shifted in the older man's face. Very small. Almost nothing. It was the kind of shift you would see only if you had spent a long time learning to watch for the things people tried not to show. He did not offer his name that night. Daniel did not ask. Over the following 9 days, Daniel came back every night. Always late, always after the volunteer shift, always with food from the diner, or twice, with a hot thermos from the apartment on Kepler Street, where he had rented a furnished room on a month-to-month lease. The man under the overhang was always there before him, always awake, always assuming the same upright position against the post. His name, Daniel would learn on the 4th visit, was Harold. Just Harold. He offered the first name with a brevity that suggested the last name was something he was not ready to attach to yet. Harold ate everything Daniel brought and never expressed gratitude in any conventional way. He said practical things. He commented on the cold. He asked about Ranger twice more, both times with the same specific. Informed interest, the dog's training, his deployment background, his temperament under stress. Questions that required actual knowledge to ask. Daniel answered honestly. Harold absorbed the answers without visible reaction, the way a man absorbs information he intends to use later. Daniel began to bring a second thermos so he could sit and drink alongside Harold instead of standing. The first time he did, Harold looked at the second thermos for a long moment before he said, You're not going to stop coming, are you? Not planning on it, Daniel said. Harold accepted this with a single nod, the kind of nod that functions as a sealed agreement. By the 12th night, they had settled into a rhythm. Harold talked in the way that men who have been alone for a long time sometimes begin to talk when they finally trust a listener. Not continuously, but in fragments, dropping a sentence the way you drop a stone into water to see how deep it goes before committing to the dive. He had been in Virginia 11 months. Before that, he had been somewhere in North Carolina. He did not name. He had a sister in Roanoke, whom he had not contacted because he was not yet prepared for what her face would do when she saw him. He had been sleeping under this particular overhang since late August because the angle of the loading dock deflected wind, and because the parking structure's security guard, a retired highway patrolman named Bud, had tacitly agreed to let it go, as long as nothing was disturbed. Harold had likely negotiated that arrangement within his first week, Daniel suspected, simply by being the kind of person who could assess another person's values quickly and speak to them precisely. Ranger rarely left Harold's immediate vicinity during these visits. By the second week, the dog had begun, at the end of each night's sitting, to press his large head briefly against Harold's knee before Daniel gave the command to walk. Harold accepted this without comment. He set one weathered hand on Ranger's skull for a moment. Each time, a gesture so automatic, it seemed like something the hand remembered doing long, before the man was prepared to think about it. On the 14th night, Daniel came earlier than usual, because a light snow had started, and he did not like the idea of Harold sitting under the overhang in falling snow with only the wool coat. He brought a second wool blanket he had bought at the Army surplus store on Bridge Street, the good kind, military specification, 4 pounds of it folded into a tight square. Harold looked at the blanket for a moment without speaking. "Storm's coming Thursday," Daniel said, sitting down with his thermos. "I know," Harold said. He took the blanket and set it across his lap without further ceremony. That hit Daniel harder than he expected. The no-fuss acceptance of it. Harold had learned to take what was offered without the complicated negotiation of pride that broke some men who had once had a lot to protect. He had learned that lesson the hard way. At some cost Daniel could not yet see clearly. He did not ask. The rule between them, unspoken but understood, was that Harold would give what he was ready to give, and Daniel would not push at the places where the door was still closed. On the 18th night, Harold told Daniel he had been married. Her name had been Patricia. They had been together 26 years, and she had died of a pulmonary embolism 9 days after his last return from a long assignment. Sitting in the chair by the window she had always sat in while she read. He had come home from the service, finally and completely, to a house where the chair was empty, and had been empty for 9 days. And the people who had called him were the neighbors because they could not reach him on deployment. He said all of this in the same flat, factual register that he said everything, looking not at Daniel, but at the middle distance where the snowflakes caught the parking structure light and broke apart. He said her name once more after the story. Patricia, low as if trying its weight. Ranger, without any signal from Daniel, stood up and walked to Harold and sat down against his left knee. Harold's hand found the top of the dog's head in the dark. Daniel looked away at the fence and the highway lights beyond it and said nothing for a long time. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. The snow that Thursday came heavier than predicted. Daniel stood outside the door of the parking structure at 9 in the evening with a large insulated bag from the diner, the second blanket folded under his arm, and a third item he had been considering for 5 days. The address of the Franklin Street Veterans Shelter, written on a card, along with the name of the intake coordinator, there whom Daniel knew personally. He stood there for a moment in the snow before he walked in. Harold was not under the overhang. Ranger moved first. He turned his nose left and walked at a contained, purposeful pace down the east side of the parking structure toward the service corridor that connected the loading dock to the adjacent building. Daniel followed. In the corridor, where the ambient warmth of the adjacent building's heating system kept the temperature perhaps 10 degrees above the outside air, Harold was sitting against the wall, fully conscious, but hunched in a way that Daniel had not seen before. His left hand was pressed against his chest, just below the sternum. His breathing was audible. Daniel crossed the corridor in 4 steps and crouched in front of him. Harold. Harold looked up. His eyes were clear, tracking, fully present. Pressure, he said. It started about an hour ago. I thought it would pass. Has this happened before? A pause. The honest pause of a man deciding whether to continue the habit of minimizing. Once, he said. 2 years ago. Daniel had his phone out. He kept his voice level. I'm calling 911. Harold did not argue. That told Daniel everything about how the man actually felt. Ranger settled close against Harold's right side, warm and solid, and Harold's right hand found the dog's neck without looking. He held it there while Daniel talked to the dispatcher, not gripping, just resting, the way a man holds on to the one thing in the room that he is certain of. The paramedics arrived in 9 minutes. They were efficient, professional, and spoke to Harold in the neutral register that good emergency responders use. Informative, but not alarming. Harold answered every question accurately and completely, in the same flat, factual tone he used for everything. And the lead paramedic, a young woman with sharp eyes, kept glancing back at Harold, as if adjusting her initial read of the situation. Daniel gave them the relevant background he had and told them where he could be reached. He rode in the ambulance. No one asked him to justify riding. He simply stated that he was coming and climbed in, and there was something in his bearing that made the question unnecessary. The hospital was County General, 12 blocks north. The cardiac unit was on the 4th floor, clean lit and quiet at 10:30 on a Thursday night. They moved Harold through intake and into an observation room, and a cardiologist appeared within 25 minutes. A tall, careful man in his 50s who reviewed Harold's blood pressure numbers on the chart before he came in and showed nothing readable in his face. Daniel waited in the corridor with Ranger, who sat close against Daniel's leg and watched the room door with the steady attention he gave to things that mattered. The cardiologist came out after 40 minutes. Angina, unstable, he said. He needs to stay overnight for monitoring and further testing. He's stable now. He looked at Daniel with an assessing expression. Are you family? No, Daniel said. I'm a friend. The doctor seemed to consider the weight of that word as Daniel had said it, which was without qualification and without apology. He's asking for you, the doctor said. Harold looked older against the white hospital pillow, which was the only surface in the room that had no warmth to offer. But his eyes had not changed. He watched Daniel walk in and said, "Sit down before you start hovering." Daniel sat in the chair beside the bed. Ranger, allowed in because Daniel had presented his service certification at intake, settled at the foot of the bed. You called fast, Harold said. Not as fast as I should have, Daniel said. You should have told me it happened before. Harold was quiet for a moment. Felt like it would fix itself. Most things feel that way, Daniel said. Most things are wrong about themselves. Harold looked at the ceiling. I have a file, he said, medical. From service. It's in a bag I keep in the back left corner of the loading dock, inside a locked box, under a false bottom in the box. If they need records. Daniel absorbed this. Deliberate concealment of important documents. Not because Harold didn't know they were important, but because Harold had arranged his entire situation to be portable, self-contained, and recoverable on short notice. This was not the arrangement of a man who had given up. This was the arrangement of a man who was still operating. What branch, Daniel said, and was not sure, even as he said it, why that particular question chose that particular moment to arrive. Harold turned his head and looked at Daniel with an expression that shifted slightly before it settled back into neutral. He was quiet for 4 full seconds. Then he said, "Army. Same as you. What was your moss?" Daniel said. Another pause longer this time. 11 Alpha, Harold said. 11 Alpha. Infantry officer, Daniel's own background. He kept his face steady. "What was your last rank?" he said. Harold's eyes held his for a long moment. "When I retired," Harold said quietly, "I was a colonel." The word landed in the room, the way that certain words do when they are attached to a weight the listener was not expecting. Daniel did not move. He sat with it. Colonel Harold, last name still unknown, sleeping under a parking structure overhang on 5th Street, eating sandwiches from a paper bag, accepting a blanket without ceremony. A colonel of infantry who had spent 11 months on the street after losing the woman he had come home for, and who had arranged his documents in a locked box with a false bottom, because old training never fully releases its hold. "I didn't know," Daniel said. "I know you didn't," Harold said. "I wasn't going to tell you." He looked back at the ceiling. "You kept coming anyway." That answer stayed in Daniel's head longer than he expected. He drove back to the parking structure in the snow and retrieved the document box from the loading dock exactly where Harold had described it, left word with Bud the security guard, and returned to the hospital. He sat in the corridor until 2 in the morning, then drove home through the empty, snow-covered streets. Ranger's bulk warm against the back seat, the city quiet in the way that only cities after snowfall can be. He did not sleep much. He lay on the narrow bed in the furnished room on Kepler Street and thought about rank, about what it is and what it isn't, about the man it had applied to, and what that man had carried alone. He thought about the distance between what a person was and what circumstances made visible to strangers. He had been bringing food to a colonel of infantry for 18 days, and the colonel had accepted it, with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. Because dignity, Daniel understood now, is not the same as status. And it is not the same as circumstance. It is something a person either has or doesn't, and it lives in the bearing, not the rank. The next morning, Daniel called a man named Gerald Foss, who ran the Regional Veterans Case Management Office and owed Daniel a professional favor from a referral situation 3 months prior. He explained the situation plainly and completely. Gerald asked 5 questions, all of them the right questions. He said he would make calls. Gerald made calls. By the following afternoon, 3 people had been in contact with the hospital: a VA liaison, a veterans housing coordinator, and an attorney who handled benefits recovery for service members whose post-separation paperwork had fallen into the specific legal category that Daniel had begun to suspect Harold's had fallen into, given 11 months on the street with full documents preserved in a locked box. This was not a man who had lost track of his paperwork. This was a man who had lost track of his will to navigate the systems he knew, at some clinical level, were still available to him. Harold remained in the hospital for 3 days. His heart was, as the cardiologist put it, under considerable stress but not beyond management, given appropriate medication, monitoring, and a reduction in the conditions that had been compressing it. The cardiologist said this with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that he was describing the consequences of exposure and grief as much as arterial disease, and who had the professional decency not to render a verdict on the life decisions that had produced them. On the second day, a woman arrived at the hospital. She was 63, square-shouldered, with white hair cut short and a face that was Harold's face, with different angles, softened by 20 additional years of a different kind of living. Her name was Ruth Alcott, née Carver. She had driven 4 hours from Roanoke. She stood in the doorway of Harold's room for a long moment without speaking, and Harold looked at her from the bed with an expression that was the most unguarded thing Daniel had seen on his face. "You should have called me," she said. "I know," Harold said. She crossed the room and sat beside him. Daniel was already standing. He took Ranger into the corridor and waited, and the door swung mostly shut behind him, and he did not need to hear the conversation that took place inside it. On the third day, Gerald Foss arrived in person with the VA liaison and a stack of paperwork that represented the beginning of a benefits recovery process. Daniel sat in on the meeting at Harold's request, not because Harold needed an advocate, but because Harold wanted a witness he trusted. The process would take time. These things always did. But the framework was real. The entitlement was clear. And the attorney Gerald had found was good at this specific kind of navigation. Harold sat up straight in the hospital bed through the entire meeting, his hands folded on the blanket in front of him, and spoke to the VA liaison and the attorney with the precise, complete, unambiguous language of a man who had spent decades communicating in writing, briefing, and formal instruction. The liaison's demeanor shifted perceptibly within the first 10 minutes of Harold's speaking. He was not the case he had walked in expecting. He was something that required adjustment. Ruth stayed in the city. She found a short-term rental 3 blocks from the hospital, a furnished studio, and moved into it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had made up her mind and did not require further conversation about it. She brought food from a grocery store she found online before she arrived, and she was in Harold's room every day when visiting hours opened. The first afternoon she was there, she brought a photograph in a small frame, Patricia in a garden, laughing at something off camera. She set it on Harold's bedside table without comment and sat down. Harold did not look at the photograph for a long time. When he did, he looked for a while, and Ruth sat beside him and did not say anything, and that was exactly right. Daniel came every evening. He brought Ranger, who was permitted by a nursing staff that had determined fairly quickly that the dog's presence was medically relevant in a way that the official forms had not anticipated. The head nurse on the cardiac floor, a compact, brisk woman in her 50s named Mrs. Tanner, had watched Ranger sit beside Harold's bed for 20 minutes on the first visit, and then simply updated the visitation log in a way that did not invite further discussion. On the third evening, Ruth met Daniel in the corridor outside Harold's room. She was 5'5", with steady hands and the kind of direct eye contact that ran in families. She looked at Daniel for a moment, and then she said, "He told me about the parking structure. He told me what you did." "I came by in the evenings," Daniel said. "That's all." "For a month," she said. "He would have done the same," Daniel said, and knew as he said it that it was not a polite thing, but the exact truth. Ruth's expression shifted. "He talked about Patricia," she said. "He talks about her to you." "Sometimes," Daniel said. She looked at the floor for a moment. "He hasn't talked about her in 3 years," she said. "Not to anyone." She looked back up. "Thank you for the thing I can't put in words easily." Daniel nodded. That was the kind of thing that didn't need a fuller response, and they both understood it. Harold was discharged on a Thursday morning, 17 days after the ambulance call. He left the hospital in the same wool coat, the military boots, and with the document box in a bag over one shoulder. Ruth walked beside him. Daniel walked on his other side, Ranger walked at Daniel's heel, and Harold looked down at the dog, once in the elevator, and said, "Good dog," in the low voice he used for things he meant at depth, and Ranger's tail moved in a single slow arc. The housing situation came together over the following 3 weeks, in the way that things come together when the right people are working on them. Gerald's attorney filed the appropriate documents. The VA liaison processed the claims with a speed that suggested someone had communicated the full picture of Harold's situation in terms that cut through the normal timeline. A veteran-specific housing assistance program in the city had a ground-floor apartment on Meridian Street. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a window that faced east, available first of the month. Ruth made a list of what it needed and took Daniel with her to a second-hand furniture place on the edge of the city, and they spent 3 hours selecting things that were sturdy and particular and did not feel temporary. Other people came. Daniel was not entirely sure how word had moved through the veterans community in the city, but it moved the way word always does in those circles, through the informal channels of men who have served and who have their own specific, bone-deep response to learning that a colonel of infantry has been sleeping rough for 11 months. A man named Frank Osterman, 62 years old, broad and deliberate, a retired master sergeant who had done his last 10 years as an MP, arrived at the Meridian Street apartment on moving day with 2 other veterans Daniel did not know, and a truck with furniture in it that turned out to include a good mattress, a kitchen table, and a wooden bookcase someone had built by hand. He shook Harold's hand at the door, and Harold shook it back, and they stood there for a moment, looking at each other with the compressed recognition of men who have covered the same ground. "Sir," Frank said, quiet but direct. Harold shook his head once. "Harold, not sir, not anymore." Frank absorbed this. "Harold," he said. They carried everything inside. Ruth had found a book 2 blocks from the apartment where she went every Wednesday, and she had already been there once and come back with 4 paperback novels she thought Harold might like, selected on the basis of a conversation she had apparently had with herself about his tastes. She set them on the kitchen table before Harold even came through the door. He looked at them when he came in, turned one over to read the back, and set it down again without comment. Later that afternoon, Daniel saw it on the bookcase, with a bookmark 3 chapters in. The city received its first real winter cold in mid-December, the kind that comes in from the northwest and settles for days. Daniel came by the Meridian Street apartment in the evenings, not every night, but several times a week, and Ranger always walked to Harold first and accepted the hand on his skull, and Harold always accepted the visit with the same minimal ceremony that was simply his way of expressing that it was welcome. Ruth fed people with a straightforward abundance that suggested she had been waiting a long time to cook for more than one person. She made a soup with beans and salt pork that became, by unspoken agreement, the thing that appeared whenever more than 3 people were in the kitchen. Frank Osterman came back. He brought the 2 veterans from moving day, and a 4th man, a retired warrant officer named Peterson, who had served in the same theater as Harold in the early 90s and who sat across the kitchen table from Harold on a Tuesday evening and said, without preamble, "I heard you were in Sinai in '91. And Harold said I was. And they talked for 2 hours in the shorthand of shared geography that people on the outside would not have been able to follow at all. Daniel sat in the corner with his thermos and said nothing and watched Ranger sleep on the floor near Harold's chair, the big shepherd turned slightly on one side, entirely at rest. That particular quality of rest, Daniel understood, was a specific signal. Ranger slept that deeply, only in places he had assessed as safe. The VA benefits determination came through in early January. It was, as the attorney had described it would be, substantially complete. 22 years of service, combat deployments, medical entitlements, a pension that had been accruing, untouched and unclaimed, for nearly 3 years since Harold's effective separation date. The attorney went through the numbers at the kitchen table with Harold and Ruth, and Harold listened to each figure with the same flat attention he brought to briefings, asking 3 questions, all of them precise and relevant. He did not visibly react to the total. He folded the paperwork and set it on the table and looked at the window for a moment. Patricia would have known what to do with all of it. "Before I finished reading the first page," he said. No one in the room tried to fill that particular silence. Afterward, when the attorney had gone, and Ruth was washing cups at the sink, Harold said to Daniel, in the low voice he used for things he said once and did not repeat, "The first time you walked across that parking structure, I thought you were going to ask me to move along." Daniel looked at him. "Why'd you stay?" Harold looked at Ranger. "Dog sat down," he said. By February, the apartment on Meridian Street had accumulated the particular quality of a lived-in place. There were books on the bookcase, a second bookcase that Frank had built in the spare room, a framed print of a topographical map of the Shenandoah Valley that Harold had chosen, himself, and hung level on the wall with the efficiency of a man who had hung many things on many walls. Patricia's photograph was on the bookcase. In the same small frame Ruth had brought to the hospital, with a small piece of sea glass beside it, that Ruth said Patricia had kept on her own windowsill. Harold did not explain this to anyone who visited. He simply left it there, and anyone with the perception to understand what it was did not need the explanation. Ruth had extended her stay in the short-term rental by 2 months, and then by 2 more. She was looking at longer-term options in the city, with the matter-of-fact deliberateness she brought to everything. And Harold had not told her to do this, but had also not told her to stop, which was its own kind of language. Frank Osterman and the others came by on Saturday mornings. There were usually 5 or 6 men by the 3rd Saturday, bringing food or tools, or, once, a cord of firewood that got stacked in the small yard behind the building, without anyone having discussed whether Harold had use for it. He did, as it turned out. He had a small outdoor fire pit that came with the apartment's yard, and he and Daniel sat beside it on the 2nd Saturday of February, with the wood fire going, the temperature in the low 30s, Ranger between their chairs, and the smell of wood smoke rising clean into the cold, clear sky. Harold held his cup in both hands, the way he always did. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the fire, and then he said, without any particular lead-in, "I was going to stay through the spring, under the overhang. Then I was going to call Ruth. But the angina moved the schedule," Daniel said. "Apparently," Harold said. He turned his cup slightly in his hands. "I was not ready for the phone call," Daniel said. "For being known again," Harold said. He said it the way he said all the things that cost something to say, flat, complete, with no invitation to soften it. "After she died, I did not want to be known. I had been known as her husband for 26 years. And then there was nobody who remembered how to know me as anything else." He paused. "I thought if I disappeared for long enough, I would figure out what was left." "Did you?" Harold looked at Ranger. "The fire snapped once. Some of it," he said. "Not all of it. Possibly there is more to find." He took a drink from his cup. "But I can look from here." Daniel looked at the fire, the pressure in his own chest, the one he had spent 4 years managing through movement and distance, and the studied avoidance of anything that required him to remain, did something he had not expected. It eased, not gone, not resolved, but eased, the way a thing eases when the weight is still there, but the surface beneath it has become more solid. He had come to this city in the late summer, planning to stay through the winter and reassess. He had filled out the month-to-month lease without thinking much about what came after. But sitting beside the fire in February, with a cord of wood stacked against the fence and the sound of Ruth moving in the kitchen behind the lit window, and Ranger's warm weight against his ankle, he understood that the reassessment had already happened. Somewhere in the evenings of a November month, spent sitting on a concrete retaining wall, and he had simply not yet named what it had concluded. He refilled Harold's cup from the thermos. Harold accepted it without looking up. In March, Daniels assigned a year's lease on a 2-bedroom apartment 4 blocks from Meridian Street. He chose it for the yard, which was large enough for Ranger to move in, and for the light from the east-facing windows, and for no other reasons he was prepared to examine closely. He carried his things in over 2 days. Harold and Frank helped on the second day. Frank brought lunch. Ruth came by in the late afternoon with soup. When the last box was in and the truck was returned, Daniel stood in the empty main room of the apartment as the winter light shifted toward evening. Ranger sitting by the door, the furnace ticking with the warmth. It was just beginning to push into the space. He thought about the long, uninterrupted arithmetic of movement that had been his life since the separation. All the cities and furnished rooms, and month-to-month leases, the practice not staying that had felt for a long time like a form of freedom, and had revealed itself, one parking structure at a time, as simply a failure to believe that anything was worth the weight of permanent presence. He thought about Harold, sitting upright against the loading dock post in the cold November air, with his documents in a locked box, and his bearing intact, and his willingness, finally, to let someone come close enough to be trusted. He thought about what it cost to be known again, about what it cost not to be. Ranger stood, walked to Daniel's side, and pressed his head against Daniel's hand. Daniel let his hand rest on the dog's skull for a moment, feeling the warm solidity of him, the steady, unhurried breathing. Finally home. There are people in this world who disappear after an enormous loss, not because they are weak, but because the weight of being known is sometimes the heaviest thing a person can carry. They sit in places where no one sees the rank, the service, the life that came before. And sometimes, if you sit with them long enough, without demanding anything from them, they begin to believe that they can be found again. This story is for those people, and for those who sat beside them in the cold and came back the next night, and the night after that. You know that patience like that is not nothing. You know it is, in fact, almost everything. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you today of someone you might sit beside.